Los Angeles, California, had a way of pretending it never slept. Even in the early hours before dawn, the city still glowed faintly through the curtains, a distant shimmer of streetlights and passing cars, a reminder that somewhere someone was always awake, always moving, always chasing something. But inside Dean Martin's home, the world had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists when exhaustion finally wins. Dean had finished a long stretch of performances and appearances. His voice, usually smooth and easy, had been hoarse when he came to bed. His shoulders, so often relaxed under stage lights, had carried a heaviness that night. Beside him, Jean slept peacefully, her breathing slow and even, her hand resting lightly against his arm as though anchoring him to the small, private life he rarely allowed himself to fully enter. Dean had drifted into a deep, unguarded sleep, the kind that comes when the mind finally loosens its grip on the day. Then the phone rang. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it felt like a gunshot. Sharp, sudden, wrong. Dean's eyes opened instantly, his heart reacting before his thoughts could catch up. The sound didn't belong to that hour, it didn't belong to that stillness. He lay still for half a second, listening as the ringing cut through the darkness again. Jean shifted beside him, murmuring softly, not fully awake. "Who could that be?" she whispered, her voice blurred by sleep. Dean didn't answer. He was already reaching for the receiver, something unsettled stirring in his chest before he even lifted it to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice thick, still pulled from the depths of sleep. For a moment there was only breath on the other end of the line, uneven, shaking, as if someone were trying and failing to steady themselves. Then a sound broke through that breath, fragile and familiar, carrying a weight that snapped Dean fully awake. "Dean, it's me." He sat up at once, the room suddenly feeling too small, too silent. "Marilyn," he said, and even as he spoke her name, he knew something was wrong. The voice on the other end was not the voice that floated through movie screens or laughed through crowded rooms. It was stripped of performance, stripped of charm. It was thin and trembling and real. "I'm sorry to call so late," she said, and then the words dissolved into quiet sobbing. I didn't know who else to call." Dean swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cool floor. Jean lifted her head now, concern in her eyes, but Dean only raised a finger gently, silently asking her not to speak. "Marilyn," he said softly, firmly, the way he had learned to speak to people when they were standing at the edge of something invisible and dangerous. "Talk to me. What's going on?" There was a pause, then her voice returned, smaller. "I'm so tired, Dean. I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't think I can keep pretending I'm okay." The words settled heavily between them. Dean closed his eyes, not in exhaustion now, but in focus. "Where are you?" he asked. "At home," she replied. "Brentwood, I didn't go out tonight. I sat here, and it got so quiet, and when it gets quiet, everything gets loud." Dean stood, already pulling on his pants, his movements quick but controlled. "Are you alone?" "Yes." Another pause, then she whispered, "Dean, I don't want to feel like this anymore." He stopped moving. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice sharpened just enough to cut through the fog he knew so well. "You're not alone, not tonight. I'm coming to you right now." "No," she said weakly, "you don't have to." "I'm coming," he repeated, already reaching for his shirt. "I want you to unlock the door, and I want you to stay where you are. Can you do that for me?" There was silence again, longer this time. Dean held the phone tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Marilyn," he said, quieter now, but no less firm. "Answer me." "Okay," she finally whispered. Dean exhaled, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Good. I'll be there soon. Just stay with me a moment. Tell me what you're doing." "I'm sitting on the couch," she said. "The lights are off." "Turn one on," he told her. "Anyone." He heard movement, the soft click of a switch. "Okay," she said. "That's it, I'm coming. Don't hang up until I tell you." But the line went dead. Dean stared at the receiver for half a second, then placed it down carefully, as though any suddenness might somehow make things worse. He turned to Jean, who was now sitting up, worry written openly across her face. "It's Marilyn," he said. "She's not okay. I have to go." Jean didn't argue. She stood and helped him into his jacket, her hands steady even though her eyes were not. "Be careful," she said quietly. He nodded once, grabbed his keys, and was out the door before the echo of it closing had fully faded. The city met him cold and empty. The roads were open, the kind of open that felt unnatural for Los Angeles. He drove fast, but not wildly. Every red light felt like a personal insult. Every stretch of empty asphalt felt too long. His thoughts raced ahead of the car, replaying her voice, the way it had broken around his name. Dean had known Marilyn Monroe for years, but he had learned early on that knowing Marilyn Monroe was not the same as knowing Marilyn. The world knew the walk, the smile, the breathy laugh, the carefully constructed glow. Dean had met the woman behind it at a party years earlier, sitting alone in a crowded room, surrounded by attention yet untouched by connection. He had asked her why she wasn't dancing, and she had looked up at him and said, "Because everyone wants to look at me and no one wants to sit with me." He had sat. And somehow that small, ordinary act had opened a door neither of them had known they were waiting for. Since then, their friendship had grown quietly without spectacle. No headlines, no performances, just conversations that didn't require her to be anything, just dinners where she could eat without cameras, just phone calls where she didn't have to sound like a star. Dean had seen the exhaustion beneath her fame, the way loneliness clung to her even when rooms were full. He had seen how deeply she felt, how fiercely she wanted to be understood not as an image, but as a person. And as he drove through the night toward Brentwood, that understanding pressed on him now like weight. Her house came into view too quickly and not quickly enough at the same time. He pulled up hard, stepped out, and crossed the distance to her door in long strides. He knocked once. Then again, louder. "Marilyn," he called, "it's me." No answer. He tried the handle, it turned. The door opened into darkness and the faint scent of flowers that had long ago lost their freshness. "Marilyn," he said again, stepping inside. The house was still, too still. Dean flicked on a light, then another, moving deeper into the space, calling her name, his voice echoing softly off walls that had held so many parties and yet now seemed to hold nothing at all. He found her in the living room. She was sitting where she'd said she would be, small against the couch cushions, her hair loose, her face pale beneath the lamp's gentle glow. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment relief flickered across her features, quickly chased by something like embarrassment. "You came," she said. "Of course I came," Dean replied, crossing to her in 2 steps and kneeling in front of her so he could see her eyes. They were tired, not the glamorous tiredness of long nights, but the deep, aching kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. "I told you I would." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite work. "I didn't think anyone would come that fast." Dean didn't answer that. Instead, he reached out and took her hands, feeling how cold they were. "Talk to me," he said gently. "What happened tonight?" And as she began to speak, haltingly at first, then in a rush of words she seemed to have been holding back for years, Dean stayed there on the floor in front of her, listening, not interrupting, not fixing, not rescuing yet. Just being there. Because sometimes, before anything else, before solutions or doctors or decisions, what a person needs most is to be seen in the dark and not be left alone in it. And in that quiet living room, while the city breathed distantly beyond the walls, the most famous woman in the world spoke not as a symbol, not as a star, but as a tired human being to a friend who had shown up when the night had felt unbearable. Dean stayed kneeling in front of her long after she had started talking, long after her words had blurred into a mixture of confession, exhaustion, memory, and quiet despair. Marilyn spoke about things she almost never said out loud. About how rooms full of applause still felt empty when the lights went out. About how being wanted by millions somehow made it harder to believe she was truly needed by even one. About how every smile the world adored had slowly become something she had to lift, like a heavy object rather than something that rose naturally from inside her. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was also relief in it, as if the simple act of being heard without interruption or judgment was loosening knots she had carried for years. Dean listened without glancing at the clock, without trying to guide the conversation, without offering the kind of empty comfort people often give when they are uncomfortable with pain. He listened because he understood something most people didn't. That loneliness isn't cured by crowds, and sadness isn't cured by success. They are only softened by presence. He noticed the way her hands shook slightly in his, the way her shoulders slumped forward as if holding herself upright required more strength than she had left. When she finally fell quiet, it wasn't because she had said everything, but because she had run out of energy to say any more. The room felt heavy with what had been shared, with all the things that had no easy answers. Dean shifted closer, still on the floor, and gently tightened his grip around her fingers. "I'm really glad you called me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm really glad you didn't sit here with all of this by yourself." She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her eyes focused fully, as if she were seeing him not as a famous friend, not as a performer she trusted, but as a person who had come into her private darkness without asking for anything in return. I didn't know who else to call, she admitted. Everyone knows Marilyn Monroe. I didn't need Marilyn Monroe tonight. Dean gave a small nod. Then it's a good thing you didn't call her, he said. It's a good thing you called me. He helped her shift back against the couch, not rushing, not treating her like something fragile that might break, but like a human being who simply needed steadiness. He moved to sit beside her rather than in front of her, close enough that she could feel his presence without feeling crowded. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It had weight, but it also had warmth. Outside, a car passed somewhere on a distant street, its sound briefly brushing the walls before disappearing again. Inside, the night seemed to pause, as though waiting to see what would happen next. Dean, Marilyn said after a while, her voice softer now, worn thin from crying. Do you ever get tired of being who everyone thinks you are? He thought about that for a moment, about the countless times he'd walked on stage when he felt nothing like the man people expected, about the way laughter and music could sometimes feel like costumes he put on rather than expressions of what lived underneath. Sometimes, he answered honestly. But then I remember that the person they see isn't all of me, and the people who matter most are the ones who don't confuse the two. She absorbed that, her gaze drifting to the far wall, to a framed photograph of herself from years earlier, all bright smile and polished glamour. I don't know who I am without it anymore, she whispered. Without the lights, without the voice they want, without the idea they've built. Dean leaned back slightly, still close. You don't have to know tonight, he said. Tonight isn't for figuring out who you're supposed to be. Tonight is just for getting through the night. That seemed to reach her in a way other words hadn't. Her shoulders eased a fraction. She nodded once. I don't think I can sleep, she said. Then don't, Dean replied. We'll just sit. So they did. They talked in pieces, not in long speeches. She told him about a scene she'd struggled with on her last project, about how everyone on set had watched her not as a person learning a role, but as a symbol they expected to perform perfectly. He told her about a night years earlier when he'd bombed on stage and gone home convinced he'd lost whatever made him worth listening to. They laughed once softly at a memory from a party long past, the sound surprising them both. The night moved slowly, not in the way it does when you're waiting for it to end, but in the way it does when time has softened and you are simply inside it. At some point, Marilyn's head tilted against the back of the couch, her eyes closing not in sleep but in something like rest. Dean noticed immediately. He didn't move away. He shifted only enough to make sure she was comfortable, draping his jacket lightly over her shoulders when he felt the coolness of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. She stirred slightly but didn't pull away. Her breathing steadied, no longer sharp with held-back tears, but slow, drawn from deeper in her chest. He stayed like that, aware that whatever had brought him there that night had not disappeared simply because the room was quiet now. He wasn't there to fix a life. He wasn't there to deliver wisdom that would undo years of pain. He was there because she had reached out, and because sometimes being there is not the first step but the entire act. Hours passed without either of them marking the time. The city outside slowly shifted from deep night toward early morning, the black of the sky thinning into something almost blue. Dean watched that change through the edge of the curtains while Marilyn rested beside him, and he thought about how strange it was that a person could be surrounded by beauty, by attention, by everything people imagine they want, and still feel unseen. He thought about how often the world celebrates what shines and ignores what hurts. And he thought about how many people never make the call she had made. When she finally opened her eyes again, it was not with panic but with quiet confusion, as if she had forgotten for a moment where she was and then remembered. She looked at him, really looked, and something softened in her expression. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I would be," he replied gently. She sat up a little, pulling the jacket closer around herself. Most people leave when things get heavy. Dean shrugged faintly. Then most people miss the important part. She studied his face as if measuring whether his calm was real or performed. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because her shoulders relaxed again. "I don't feel better," she admitted, "but I don't feel as lost." "That's enough for one night," he said. "You don't have to feel better, you just have to feel here." She nodded. The light in the room had changed now, no longer purely artificial. Morning was approaching. With it would come questions, expectations, calls, headlines, responsibilities. The world would soon wake and remember Marilyn Monroe. But in that moment before any of that arrived, there was only Marilyn, a tired woman sitting on her couch, wrapped in a jacket that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and aftershave, looking at a friend who had come when she asked. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dean didn't answer right away. He looked around the room at the carefully chosen furniture, at the awards on the shelves, at the photographs that captured only fragments of a life. "You don't have to thank me," he said at last. "This is what friends do. They show up when the night gets loud." She swallowed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Then, don't go yet." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And as the first true light of morning slipped across the floor, touching the edges of the room, Dean stayed beside her. Not as a singer, not as a star, but as a man who had answered a call in the dark and chosen not to leave when he saw what waited there. Morning did not arrive all at once. It came gradually, like something careful not to startle. The pale blue of the sky slipped quietly through the curtains, touching the corners of the room, softening the shadows that had made the night feel heavier than it already was. The house that only hours before had seemed hollow and echoing now looked ordinary, even gentle, as if it were trying to pretend nothing had happened within its walls. Dean noticed the change before Marilyn did. He watched the way the light found her face, revealing the fine lines of exhaustion beneath her makeup, the vulnerability she hid from cameras but could not hide from daylight. She sat with her knees drawn slightly toward her chest, wrapped in his jacket, staring at nothing in particular, as though the night had not fully released her yet. They spoke little at first, not because there was nothing to say, but because the kind of conversations that follow emotional storms often don't begin with words. Dean made coffee in the kitchen, the small domestic sounds filling spaces that had earlier been occupied by silence. Marilyn listened to him move about, opening cabinets, setting cups on the counter, the ordinary rhythm of life resuming around her. When he returned and placed a warm mug in her hands, she looked up with something close to surprise, as if she had forgotten that comfort could take such simple forms. She cupped the mug carefully, breathing in the steam, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. "I always forget how quiet mornings can be," she said softly. "That's because nights like that make everything loud," Dean replied. She gave a faint, almost shy smile at that and took a small sip. The coffee seemed to anchor her, to remind her that she was still in her body, still here, still part of the ordinary world. They talked then, not about despair or fear, but about small things, about a film she'd seen once as a child that still made her cry, about a song he was working on but hadn't decided whether he'd ever record. The conversation wandered without pressure. There was no attempt to solve a life in a single morning. There was only an attempt to keep her from slipping back into the quiet, where everything became too loud again. Eventually, Marilyn set the mug aside and leaned back into the couch. "What happens now?" she asked, not with panic, but with a tentative curiosity that had been missing from her voice the night before. Dean considered her carefully before answering. "Now," he said, "we don't pretend this didn't happen. We don't treat it like a bad dream and move on. We make sure you don't have to carry all of this by yourself." She looked down at her hands. "People don't like to hear about this part of me." "I know," he said gently, "but that doesn't make it less real." There was a long pause, the kind that invites honesty if it is handled gently enough. "I don't trust myself to always feel the way I feel right now," she admitted. "This morning feels calmer, but I know myself. I know how fast it can change." Dean nodded. "That's why this morning isn't a promise that everything is fine. It's just a starting place, and starting places are meant to be shared." She exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she had been holding since before the night began. For years, Marilyn had been surrounded by people who relied on her being okay, who depended on her smile, her reliability, her ability to transform herself into whatever was needed. There had been very few spaces where she was allowed not to be fine. Dean's presence offered one, not because he was powerful or persuasive, but because he was steady. And steadiness, she was beginning to realize, was rarer than brilliance. They decided he would stay a little longer, not because she begged, and not because he felt obligated, but because neither of them wanted the fragile calm to be interrupted too quickly by the outside world. He called Jean to let her know he was safe and would be back later. Marilyn made a light breakfast, moving slowly, carefully, as though her body were something she was learning again. They ate at the small table in her kitchen, sunlight creeping across its surface, turning the ordinary plates and cups into something almost luminous. It felt strangely intimate, this simple act of eating together, stripped of glamour and noise. It felt like life. Over the next days, Dean did not disappear back into his world and leave her alone with hers. He checked in. He visited when he could. Sometimes they talked about heavy things. Sometimes they didn't talk about them at all. He brought her records he thought she might like, old jazz singers she had never taken the time to listen to. She showed him poems she'd been scribbling in notebooks she rarely let anyone see. They walked in her garden once, slow and unhurried, while she spoke about wanting, desperately, to be taken seriously as something more than a symbol. Dean listened the same way he had that first night, not trying to reshape her feelings, but letting them exist. What surprised Marilyn most was not that someone had come when she called, but that someone kept coming after the crisis had passed. There were plenty of people in her life who appeared during premieres and parties when her laughter was easy and her image polished. Very few remained when the lights were low and her voice unguarded. Dean did. And in that continued presence, something in her began to shift, not dramatically, not miraculously, but subtly, like the slow turning of a face toward warmth. She began to speak about the future again, not as a demand, but as a possibility. One afternoon, as they sat on her patio listening to the distant sound of lawnmowers and traffic, she told him she had been thinking about going somewhere quiet for a while, somewhere without cameras, somewhere she could remember what it felt like to wake up without performing. Dean encouraged the idea without pressing it. "You deserve space to breathe," he said. "Not everything has to be decided in front of an audience." There were setbacks, of course, days when she canceled plans, evenings when her voice on the phone sounded tired again. But now, when that happened, she did not retreat into silence. She reached out, and each time she did, she found not solutions, but connection. And connection, she was discovering, changed the shape of pain. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the night of the call, Marilyn stood in her living room holding a script she had been struggling to even open. She turned it over in her hands, uncertain. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of failing. I'm scared of succeeding and still feeling empty." Dean looked at her thoughtfully. "Then don't measure what you do next by success," he said. "Measure it by whether it feels honest." She absorbed that in silence. Later, she would tell him that sentence stayed with her, that it followed her into rooms where she usually lost herself, that it reminded her that being alive was not the same thing as being admired. As the weeks passed, there were moments when Marilyn laughed with a lightness that surprised even her. Moments when she caught herself speaking quickly, energetically about ideas instead of fears. She was not suddenly healed. She was not suddenly safe from herself. But she was engaged again, and engagement, she was learning, was a form of hope. One afternoon, she called Dean not because she was breaking, but because she had just watched a ridiculous television program and wanted to complain about it. He laughed when he realized why she'd called, a deep, relieved laugh that carried something like gratitude in it. After they hung up, he stood in his living room for a long moment holding the silent phone, aware that the greatest change was not that her life had been dramatically altered, but that she was still choosing to speak. Marilyn knew even then that whatever happened in her life from that point forward, the night she had called Dean would remain a dividing line. There was before, when her suffering felt sealed inside her, and there was after, when it had been witnessed. And though witnessing did not erase it, it had made it less absolute. She told him that once, standing by the open door of her home as he prepared to leave. "When you came that night," she said quietly, "it was like someone turned a light on in a room I thought was already completely dark." Dean met her gaze. "The light was already there," he replied. "You just needed someone to help you see it." And as he drove away, she stood in the doorway watching until his car disappeared down the street, feeling something unfamiliar but deeply precious settle into her chest. It was not happiness. It was not certainty. It was something quieter and stronger. It was the feeling that she was not invisible. Time has a way of softening memories without truly erasing them. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and the night Marilyn had called Dean at 2 in the morning slowly took its place among the countless moments that made up both of their lives. On the surface, the world saw what it always saw when it looked at Marilyn: photographs, headlines, appearances, rumors. But beneath that surface, something real had been altered. There were still difficult days, still moments when the weight of being Marilyn Monroe pressed against her with familiar force. But there were also mornings when she woke and reached instinctively for the phone, not because she was afraid of the silence, but because she wanted to share something small, something ordinary, something human. Dean noticed that change more than anyone else. The calls that once came trembling now sometimes came with laughter. The pauses that once carried despair now often carried thoughtfulness. And though he never allowed himself to believe that a single night could rewrite a person's inner world, he knew it had opened a door that had once seemed locked from the inside. They spoke often in those months, not always about pain and not always about hope, but about the strange, fragile space where the two coexist. Marilyn talked about wanting to study again, about taking classes without telling anyone, about sitting in the back of a room where no one expected her to be anything at all. Dean encouraged her without shaping her plans, understanding that what she needed most was not direction but permission. Permission to move slowly. Permission to question. Permission to be unfinished. Sometimes he visited when schedules allowed, and they would sit in her living room listening to records, or walk in her garden, or talk about nothing more significant than whether the roses had ever survived a season without losing half their petals to the wind. Those small hours, unrecorded and unseen, became a quiet counterweight to the world she faced outside her gate. What neither of them said aloud, but both of them felt, was that something precious had been entrusted between them. Not a secret, not a story, but an understanding. Dean had seen Marilyn not as a myth in crisis, but as a person who had reached the edge of her own endurance and asked not to be alone there. Marilyn had seen Dean not as a public figure or a charming voice, but as someone who would arrive when applause could not. That recognition lingered. It shaped the way she spoke to him. It shaped the way he thought about her long after their conversations ended. And in the midst of a world that thrived on surfaces, that shared depth became its own form of shelter. Years later, Dean would struggle to articulate what that night truly meant to him. Interviewers would ask about the people he had known, the legends, the beauty, the chaos of old Hollywood, and Marilyn's name would inevitably surface. He never dramatized it. He never turned it into spectacle. He spoke instead about kindness, about loneliness, about how easy it is to miss what is happening inside a person when the outside shines too brightly. He spoke about the danger of assuming that someone who is adored cannot also be aching. And when he spoke of Marilyn, there was always a pause first, as though he were acknowledging not an image, but a memory that deserved care. What stayed with him most was not the fear of that night, but the stillness that followed it. The image of her sitting on the couch in the early morning light, wrapped in his jacket, holding a cup of coffee like it was something precious. The sound of her voice when she realized he had not left. The quiet way she said his name then, without panic, without performance. That moment became, for Dean, a private reminder of what truly matters when everything else falls away. Not fame, not success. Not even happiness in its loudest sense, but presence, the willingness to step into another person's darkness without turning away. Long after Hollywood had moved on to new stories, new faces, new myths, Dean would still think about how thin the distance can be between a life that feels unbearable and a life that feels possible. Sometimes that distance is nothing more than a phone call. Sometimes it is nothing more than a door opening in the middle of the night. And sometimes it is nothing more than one person saying, "I'm here," and meaning it. In the end, what Dean carried forward was not regret, but responsibility. The responsibility to answer when someone reached out. The responsibility to look beyond what people project and notice what they endure. The responsibility to remember that no amount of admiration replaces the need for connection. He became, quietly, someone people confided in. Not because he advertised wisdom, but because he had learned how to listen without rushing to escape what he heard. He had learned that being strong for someone does not mean having the right words. It means being willing to stay when words are not enough. And Marilyn, in the time she had after that night, carried something forward as well. She carried the knowledge that her pain had been seen and not rejected. That knowledge did not erase her struggles, but it changed the way she met them. It gave her a memory to return to when the familiar shadows crept back in. A memory of light on a living room wall, of a friend's jacket on her shoulders, of a man who had not tried to fix her only to stay. This is why their story endures, not as a tale of glamour or tragedy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the most meaningful acts often happen far from stages and cameras. A reminder that the nights that shape us most are rarely the ones the world applauds. And a reminder that saving a life is not always about dramatic gestures. Sometimes it is about answering a call. Sometimes it is about sitting through the long hours until morning. Sometimes it is about proving, through presence alone, that someone matters enough to be met where they are. Because in the end, what Dean gave Marilyn that night was not advice, or solutions, or even certainty. He gave her something quieter and far more powerful. He gave her the experience of not being alone when she believed she was. And that experience, however briefly it lasted, mattered. It mattered because it affirmed something the world often forgets. That every person, no matter how admired, no matter how celebrated, still needs to be seen as a human being first. And perhaps that is the true legacy of that call in the early hours of a Lowe's Angels morning. Not the fear that preceded it, but the love that answered it. Not the darkness that made it necessary, but the light that arrived in response. Because sometimes, the most important thing we will ever do for another person is not to change their life, but to walk into it when they ask, and to stay long enough for them to remember they are still here. And that is always worth answering for.